It looks like the Tories have finally admitted that Margaret Thatcher, or Saint Margaret as she's known in Tory circles, got it wrong when she sold off thousands of council houses and stopped local authorities from replacing them. Here she is in 1980, handing over the sales deeds to one of the first council houses bought under the Right to Buy scheme. Personally, I had no problem with selling council houses at below market prices to long-term tenants. It was a massive shift of wealth to some of the poorest people in society. The problems came when councils were then stopped by the Tory government from spending that money, the money they received from council house sales, to build more social housing. And this is one of the reasons behind the current housing crisis in this country. We just haven't got enough cheap homes for rent. In many parts of Britain, young people, especially those who haven't got a bank of mum and dad, can't afford to buy, and nor can they afford to pay exorbitant open market rents. It seems the Tories have finally accepted this as a big problem and want councils to build more social housing. But isn't that what they used to do before Mrs Thatcher's great crusade? Haven't we now come full circle?
I agree with you, Greg. I mean, I think that Tory policy has been quite catastrophic for social housing. And actually, to be fair, not just Tories, because we've seen continuous decline in social housing over the last 2 decades. But if you look at what groups like Shelter say, they say we need 250,000 new homes a year. And what the Tories are saying, if you actually look at the small print, there's no actual new money, as far as I can see, in their manifesto for new homes. They said it's going to come out of existing money, and they've said that they're going to be, I think they said 40,000 new homes, but actually it looks like it might be more like 14,000, given, you know, the amounts that are going around. So I do really wonder, one, whether this is actually going to happen, and two, whether if more council houses are built, they will be replaced, because there was never an explicit commitment not to replace social housing once it was sold off, was there? It just kind of didn't happen. I think 1 in 8, every 8 council houses that was sold, 1 was rebuilt. And that's why we've got such depleted social housing stock.
Well, I mean, I also think something changed in an attitude about council housing, that I think a lot of big council estates got stigmatised, that if you came from there you were going to struggle in life and all those sorts of things. And I think, personally, I wouldn't go back to massive council housing. I would go back to building for councils to plan and do the strategy for housing, but I get housing associations to build them, but they've got to be at a rent that people can afford. And I don't know what you do now in certain parts of this country. You know, people with quite good wages can't afford to rent and they can't afford to buy.
Right. Well, since we're in an election period, let me just say what the parties will say they will do. So Labour say if they're elected, they'll build 1 million homes over the next Parliament, at least half of which will be council houses for rent. The Lib Dems have said they've got a target of 300,000 new homes a year. That's more than what Shelter says we need. And the Tories say they will stick to their commitment to build 1 million homes by 2020, which is almost in line with what apparently we need, and add a further 500,000 by the end of 2022. I mean, I think it is interesting that all the parties, there's a kind of consensus, isn't there, for the first time that we do need something quite radical in house building. So that in itself is progress. It's just a question of...
Well, just building houses alone won't be enough, because, I mean, you know, we all know if you go in London, if you go now to Manchester, you're actually seeing whole blocks that have been built and are left empty because they're bought by people overseas who want to get some money in this country, and they don't care if they get a return on them. They're just getting money out of their country into here.
You guys are saying that Labour had a good record on building homes.
I said
no, they did not. They did not. In their 13 years in power, Afua, Labour built 7,870 homes. In Maggie Thatcher's time in power, she built 496,000 homes.
And how many of those were sold into the private sector?
But it's irrelevant. How many of these ones were sold into the private sector? How much was it Labour? But you know, and yes, while I think I love the fact that Maggie Thatcher did this right to buy, because I come from an area where nobody owned their own home, and when they were allowed to, finally it was a matter of dignity and pride and something they could pass on to their kids. However, now I'm not so sure it's going to work, because the people in the direst need now will never be able to raise a mortgage, never, and there are going to be even less homes for them. Even if we build 14,000 or 40,000, there's going to be less homes for them to live in. You know, selling off now, I don't think it's going to work for people, because you're just depleting the stock we have.
But that's not what they're saying. They're going to be fair to them. They're not,
as I read it, years,
and I haven't read the manifesto, but as I read it, they're not necessarily... You've got to live there for 15 years.
Yes.
And they're then saying, well, we'll take that money and build another one. Now, I see nothing wrong with that if you can do it. The other interesting thing that is suggested is that they're going to change the rules about land, that instead of it being land that's designated for housing, you buy the land and then you build the housing. Well, that means you can build cheaper housing.
Yeah,
and that's what they should do. It should be social housing. It should be for rent. I don't think it should be the enormous estates that were built post-war, because I think they do carry a stigma. But I do think you could a government encouraging local authorities to have a plan, a strategy for how you get more rent.
Or housing association.
Well, it doesn't. As long as it's fairly low rent, it doesn't matter. I'd have housing association because I don't think it carried the same stigma.
Do you think that stigma's still out there?
Well,
now?
it was interesting. Do you remember the riots of was it 2011 now? Gosh, so long ago already. I thought it was very telling that David Cameron's reaction to that was to have announced a sink estate strategy, and he had a statistic for how many rioters came from what he called sink estates. And actually, the main plank of government policy to respond to the riots was to demolish them.
But Carol's point there, these people these poor souls and I'm just going to use it, I don't believe in that term, but these things, they can't afford to buy them. They're never going to get the money. So it won't affect it, it won't influence it at all, will it?
Yeah, so the poorest... So what we'll be doing in selling council houses will be effectively helping people who can already help themselves a bit, and we will not be helping the people in the direst circumstances who will never be able to raise the money.
If the promise is kept that every council house that's sold is replaced, then that's not... The problem is, as I think Greg completely rightly said, it's not allowing people to buy council houses. The problem, it's not replacing them with more social housing.
We're never going to go back to the days when the Tories were building. They never built less than 70.
Come on, all the parties. I mean, a plague on all their houses.
Yes.
Because as you read all three parties' manifestos, I guarantee you, people up and down the land would have been laughing at all three. All three numbers.
But if you're trying to buy a house today, I got the figures. The average house in the UK is now 215,000.
But in London, it's twice that.
472.
We've got to accept that London and the rest of the UK are different. It's not just building more houses, it's about looking at rents, it's about looking at overseas landlords, it's about the block buying of council housing. For example, my son is living in a former council house. There is no, there's no sitting room, there's a tiny kitchen, and they're all paying through the nose for a one-bedroom each. Landlords are gouging tenants as well. The whole thing needs to be looked at. It's not going to be solved just by building more houses.
Because of the shortage of council housing, one of the biggest scandals, I think, is that councils are paying private landlords extortionate amounts to house people in substandard private housing. If we built more public housing, then we could at least control the quality of housing. People would have access to homes instead of what's currently happening, which is spending more in the private sector. It's going into landlords' pockets and they're ripping people off.
One of the great tragedies in this country, actually, was if you look at the Wilson government, who had a commitment to building a lot of houses and did build a lot. Unfortunately, it was the same time as tower blocks came along, and they disproportionately built some pretty horrible tower blocks.
But they looked good at the time, didn't they? It's only later we realised what they did to people's living standards.
Socially, that tower blocks weren't great for families. Although you go to other countries and they cope with that quite easily.
They work very well.